Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 27th of November 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your hosts, Ryan Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives.
Well, we're going to start with defence actually, and RUSI, because RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, is publishing a report called The Future of Fires. They're launching this report on Friday, and really they're concerned about the state of Britain's armed forces, they say. And so let's just have a look at some of the points that they're making. First of all, they say the increasing density and sophistication of Russia's integrated air defence system promises to rob NATO ground forces of air support in the first weeks of any high-intensity conflict. They say that NATO ground forces will therefore need to depend on its artillery for firepower. And they say that unfortunately NATO artillery is overmatched by Russia's. NATO artillery is outgunned, outranged and outnumbered. The modernisation of artillery therefore must be a priority for the British Army. And then they say that given that it is not fiscally viable to match Russia gun for gun, it is important not to simply replicate existing capabilities, but rather to pursue emerging capabilities that offer a transformative advantage in the delivery of firepower. So here's the point, Brian and David. NATO's budget on defence is $1 trillion, and that includes 50 billion of UK budget, and that 50 billion UK budget is also counted as part of the EU budget, which is somewhat north of $200 billion. And that's compared to a Russian defense budget of $61 billion. So my first question to you both, start with Brian, is how does that work? How is it that, according to RUSI, it is not fiscally viable to match Russia gun for gun when they are spending 6% of the West's budget on defense?
Well, it's a very interesting question. My initial reaction was the one I expressed earlier this morning, which is I think what we've got to look at is the immense profits that are being made on industry by the military industrial complex in the West, because everything is to do with vast profits. That's one point. The second point is, although we keep talking about cooperation across defence with the various bilateral agreements, we're going to work with the French on a particular defence initiative, or the Germans, or we're going to be in a club to produce something like the old Tornado. When you come down to cost efficiency, this way of operating is not cost efficient. Whereas, of course, what the Russians are doing is investing in-house. Everybody knows what the plan is. Everybody gets on board the plan. They're spending the money in Russia, and Russians are ultimately producing the equipment. This is efficient. So those are my starting comments on it. But you're absolutely right. There's something very wrong here. Very, very wrong.
So I'm not going to disagree with anything that you've said, but I am going to say that the scale of the disparity between the West and Russia seems to me that it's bigger than that. And so my question, David, is this statement true, given that it's not fiscally viable to match Russia gun for gun? Or is the second part of this RUSI statement of more interest, because they're saying, but rather to pursue emerging capabilities that offer a transformative advantage in the delivery of firepower? And my question to you, David, is that emerging capability that they're talking about EU defence? Is that what they're talking about?
It could well be, because it's cloaked language, isn't it? So the opening statements on the level they're pitching it at seem to be sort of quite sensible, which is matching gun for gun. So I think that's probably a bit of a we need to say something that's relatively coherent, and then we'll get into the real meat of the job, which is really this sort of emerging capability and what they're talking about there, and what actually that is in terms of actual military capability rather than the system. So let's say if EU Defence Union was the operating system, actual offensive capability within that, they're two different things. So I've got to say, though, there's a bit of a taint about it's got a bit of a tinge, frankly, there of tactical nuclear stuff. Really, that's very, very worrying with all the intermediate nuclear missile stuff that's happened recently in the treaties. But we come back to some fundamentals, of course, is that no one could go in the airspace because of the S-400 system. So that's quite, they're admitting that now. That's like we can't fly because that's way too good. And we've got these elephants in the room, haven't we, with the quantity of money that the Westphalian Partnership is spending on defence and what Russia's spending on defence. So someone needs to sort of wake up and smell the coffee and go, well, we're not doing it anything like as well as what they are. And all your arguments are a complete load of tosh. But we come back to one fundamental now with this, that their argument is that Russia is so bad. All right. So this is their argument. All right. So I'm only using the words that they're using. So if that is the case, why have we cut Britain's defence inventory and Britain's offensive and defensive capability to a point where it's at it is now, where it just can't operate? I could use very harsh language, but so the argument does not stack up.
Right.
So there's something other going on. There is more to this than this sort of facade of an argument, because it's not really a genuine argument at all. So there's something more and other, and it is all pivotal on this new European Defence Union that's about to be fully exposed as this week sort of goes on, with Nigel Farage and Brexit Party getting the lid off it whilst we wait for Mr. Trump to turn up next week.
Okay, well, let's see what the Ministry of Defence answer was to this, because it was a bit pathetic. The UK does not stand alone, but alongside its NATO allies who work closely together across air, sea, land, nuclear and cyber to deter threats and respond to crises. So maybe that echoes a little bit of what you just said, David, or at least admits to what you've just said. But we've got to remember, of course, that the question is it NATO or is it the EU? And let's remind ourselves of the European Defence Union diagram and the fact that, of course, on the right-hand side there, the core partnership of NATO. NATO is the cornerstone of EU defence, as the UK government keeps saying that NATO is the cornerstone of Britain's defence. Well, on Monday, actually, we had this event going on. This is the cornerstone, as we say. The Director General of NATO's International Military Staff, Lieutenant General Hans-Werner Veerman, and the Director General of the European Union Military Staff, Lieutenant General Esa Pukkanen, co-chaired the second NATO-EU biannual meeting this year. This is the second biannual meeting of this year. What did they talk about? A joint assessment on the development of the military staff-to-staff informal coordination plan. They talked about logistic and medical collaboration. They talked about Russia. They talked about cyber defense cooperation. They talked about intelligence staff cooperation. They talked about, or they provided an update to each other on the implementation of the military-related common set of 74 action items, as stated in the joint declaration by the President of the European Council, the President of the European Commission, and the Secretary General of NATO. And this, of course, is based on the NATO-EU declaration that was signed in December 2016 and later reaffirmed in July 2018. And they discussed information sharing. They discussed the possibility of increasing EU's participation in NATO exercises and NATO's participation in EU exercises. And they also discussed the development of coherent, complementary and interoperable defence capabilities while avoiding duplication. And this last point is really the key point here, whilst avoiding duplication, because very interestingly, over the last couple of days, we've had statement from the head of Airbus with respect to Tempest. Now, Tempest is the UK's sixth generation fighter program. So this is a generation further in the future than the F-35. And the Tempest is going to replace the Eurofighter, apparently. And the Tempest is being developed by British Aerospace alongside Italy and Sweden. But there's, unfortunately for the EU, there is a competitive program. That's the Franco-German Future Combat Air System. And these two things are in competition with each other. And this doesn't work in the world of single point procurement, which is part of EU Defence Union. So here is Guillaume Faury, the chief executive of Airbus, and he said it's important that the Franco-German project keeps moving forward. Will there be a possibility to have one European project at a later stage? I hope so. Well, in fact, he was going a little bit further than that. He said Europe needs one strong project for securing its air and space sovereignty, and absolutely was calling for these projects to merge in the not too distant future. So this is single point EU defence procurement, but we have to remember that that is UK defence policy, because here's Duncan Sandys, and of course he wrote the Defence White Paper in 1957, which absolutely decimated the UK's defence aerospace capability, and his policy was to merge all the British aerospace companies that were working in the defence field at the time into one or two companies, and he made it quite clear the contracts would only be awarded to the merged companies. This isn't a literal quote that I've got on screen at the moment, but it sums up his position. He wanted single point control of procurement at a UK level in 1957. But the other thing that we've got to remember is that Duncan Sandys established the European movement in the UK in 1947. So this was somebody who was working towards a pan-European model for this kind of thing. So it's hardly surprising then that the EU defence policy with respect to procurement is that the contracts go to a single organisation, a single company, David, and it's not surprising, therefore, that the head of Airbus is calling for Britain to effectively drop its Tempest programme and merge that into the EU's version of it.
Yes, exactly the case. It's you need to pack up what you're doing with that, and you need to amalgamate BAE and Rolls-Royce into our single point European single defence contractor, whatever they're going to call that. That's academic. You can call it whatever they want. But you've really hit the nail on the head there. It's such a significant statement there that you put on screen, with Sandys forming the EU movement and then immediately going into the white paper development for aircraft and defence procurement and defence production. And defensive capability or offensive capability is come from his point of view there, that the two things are hand in glove. So this notion that we thought that the European Economic Community wanted control of coal and steel, well, that's not all it wanted control of. It wanted control of the military and the defence industry and all the policy and the capital procurement, capital budgets, operational budgets thereof. So we've got to sort of say really that this now comes into two sort of very significant problems. Brexit, what's happening with the parties which are refusing to talk about defence and defence industry thereof, and the policy comics that have just come out with the manifestos at the moment. There doesn't seem to be any room in there for increasing defensive or offensive capability. They're very much at the status quo. So we've got this huge elephant in the room now with this. And I've got to say thank you very much to this gentleman at Airbus for raising this, because this is bringing the matter into the debate. So what's at stake? Whatever engineering is left and manufacturing in Britain is left, and the Commonwealth for that matter, because there's a lot of overlap, and the United States, is all going to be impacted by this if it proceeds. So we've got government golden shares in BAE and Rolls-Royce, and they will all be affected by this. So let's say that this does happen and they pull it off and they have one single point company. What does that mean for jobs, design diversity, engineering capacity, engineering productivity, so on and so forth? And I'm going to come back to a couple of fundamentals here. So let's say that they go on from aircraft and they then want to do it with ships, submarines, and all the other tackle. And heaven forbid, nuclear weapons as well. So if we come back to pre-Sandys, when we were producing aircraft like the Hawker Hunter or the English Electric Lightning, let's make a direct comparison with the production costs, the design costs, the time to get into the air and be proven and airworthy with those aircraft done by private companies, and then we go into effectively some sort of hyper Soviet communist socialist model with the single point policy, how long it has taken to produce EFA, the European fighter, the Tornado, and the Typhoon. Those costs, somebody needs to sit down and have a proper debate about what's gone on there, because I do not accept that it is cheaper and quicker to do it this way, and yet that is their argument.
Yes.
Well, I'm just going to say you sum it up there very well, David. You've only got to look at all of these meetings that take place in the European Union, and we had General Sir Nick Carter taking place in the EU Military Committee round table a little while ago. They are away, it's talk, it's drinks with the boys, it's not actually producing anything, it's wasted time. Back come the minutes, that's all disseminated, it's discussed again. This is the problem. We've got, I'm going to call it the hope and change movement, which are driving for the European Union side, versus focus and stability. And if I just bring it back to the Russians, what are the Russians demonstrating at the moment? That they are focused, they've got stable Russian-based industry, and it's churning out the goods, whereas we're in this morass of talks and discussions and coalitions.
I mean, that's exactly the case. If you look at Typhoon, EFA, Jagdflugzeug, Airbus, whatever you want to call the thing, you know, the what's supposed to be the pinnacle of this policy from the Sandys, somebody needs to have a good hard look at it, because the question we've now got with really what Russia's just said there is, this thing cannot fly or go into battle or go into anger because it's obsolete. S-400 has made it obsolete. So it's a complete turkey. So we've got to ask, is F-35 a complete turkey under the circumstances? Because why are we building these new aircraft? Why are they going into this notion of two? We're down to the sort of semi-final, aren't we? We've got just two left. We've got Tempest and whatever the Franco-German is. It's the semi-final. We've got the grand final coming up where they're going to have one company and one aircraft, and think that that's then going to be the tooling to amalgamate the entire continent.
This, of course, is not an election issue yet. Although it looks like Nigel Farage is attempting to make it one. Defence is an issue. He was talking. This is him speaking in Plymouth on Monday evening, and he was, I believe, in Barnsley last night. And EU Defence Union was on his agenda. So the question is, why has he shifted his position on this to the point where he's talking about it openly now? Is it the pressure that's been built by Brexit Party members who keep asking him questions about this? That may be part of it. Or is it partly this as well? So this is Defence News, a US-based defence publication. British Prime Minister's party practically ignores defence issues as it preps for elections. So is it, David, do you think that the Trump administration has suddenly realised what's going on with defence in the EU and defence in Europe? The fact that Boris Johnson is silent on this is starting to raise alarm bells, because perhaps the United States is still living under the idea that Britain is somehow on their side or with them, with a special relationship, whereas it seems to be that the UK, while it's silent on defence union, seems to be getting into bed with the Europeans on this issue. So do you think the Trump administration has suddenly woken up to this and they're getting concerned about it, and perhaps Nigel Farage has been encouraged by them to start talking about it?
There's this traffic and chatter that's coming out now is certainly alluding to that happening. So to where they're going to go with it, I don't know. I'm certainly not privy to that. That's not that side of the big end of the intelligence is not where we go. But it's certainly looking that way, and I think that's probably a sensible way to be looking at it over the next week. I think probably there was a good indicator for that last week with some comments coming from undersecretaries of defence in America making comments about industry and procurement relative to Europe. So yes, I think probably they're waking up by the look of it. But we're gonna hopefully see it sort of play out this week and next week when all this starts to sort of get talked about at the NATO summit. So I mean, Trump's you've got to look at Trump's big mandate really, which was jobs, security, and industry. The middle classes in America, and he's if he wants to retain those big in that sort of level of grade one industry in America, this is a key area of focus, because obviously all of the other engineering anchors off the defence. It feeds off it. There's a symbionts. It's vital, and this is obviously where from my point of view we've gone wrong in Britain, because we've annihilated, as we've cut the actual defence inventory. What we've done is we've cut the industry. And in cutting the industry, the grade one defence industry in Britain, we have taken out, or it's allowed these opportunities for all the other stuff to go, because it couldn't. That was the trunk of the main body of the capability in Britain, and it's literally just gone as we cut defence. Our manufacturing and industry in Britain has gone with it, dramatically more so.
Yeah.
So a lot to think about, but we can assume that steel and the ability to produce steel as a nation is an important factor in being able to defend your own country. It used to be coal and steel. Okay, the coal bit has changed, but steel is still a factor. So this is a pretty interesting little story as we follow it through. We're going back a couple of months ago here, but The Guardian was reporting the prospect of a Turkish rescue of British steel. Then says this raises some concerns, and of course we've got to remember the background of concerns over the Turks and their new relationship with those nasty Russians. They were going to be our friends, they were going to service our F-35 engines, but then they decided to side with those nasty Russians. But they were still going to help us out, because they were going to buy the remains of our steel making capability. So here was the article. Ata Holdings, owned by the Turkish Army Retirement Fund OYAK, is in exclusive talks to buy British Steel out of liquidation. If it goes ahead, the takeover is expected to secure the future of a site in Scunthorpe, one of the UK's last two blast furnace steelworks, as well as the jobs of more than 4,000 staff. And we'll give you a little bit more. Talks between OYAK and the official receiver managing the sale are understood to be at an advanced stage. OYAK has reportedly offered to pay up to 70 million. Remember that figure, pay up to 70 million for the company and invest up to 900 million. But the success of the deal could depend on the extent to which the government is able to offer grants, indemnities, loan guarantees to British Steel, with negotiations ongoing over a package potentially worth 300 million. So everything being lined up there quite nicely to let effectively the Turkish Army Retirement Fund run part of our steel industry. And what did that Turkish fund do? Well, it looked after retired army veterans in Turkey. So what a good system. Well, it gets better than that. Let's just have a look. But reports of alleged atrocities committed during the Turkish army's incursion in Syria have resulted in misgivings amongst campaigners, trade union officials and MPs about the prospect of British Steel being subsumed into the investment portfolio of OYAK, which funds soldiers' retirement payouts. Well, luckily those nasty Turks didn't get their deal, because let's move on. British Steel could be sold, to be sold to Chinese firm in deal that could save 4,000 jobs. And if we have a look at the next bit, Yingyi Group agrees a 50 million buyout that prevents closure of Scunthorpe plant.
It's getting cheaper.
It's getting cheaper for those nasty Chinese. They're able to move in at a mere 50 million to take it over. And then the journalist, Niels Pratley, says a buyer is welcome, but what is Yingyi's strategy? Well, let's have a look at what those cunning Chinese have got up their sleeve. They're planning to invest about 1.2 billion in British Steel over the next decade, including upgrading, lowering emissions and improving energy efficiency. So that's all pretty good stuff. This was part of the furore. Sorry, this slide should have been with the previous Turkish one. I'll just give that one now. The Turkish military is committing war crimes in northeastern Syria. It's wrong that they be enriched on the backs of the labour of Scunthorpe steelworkers. So that Turkish one absolutely thrown out on the back of the track record of the Turks, but with the Chinese it's absolutely no problem. So let's have a look at what the Chinese have said. Now this is a very good report, mainly in Grimsby Live, but I have taken this direct quote from The Guardian. So it's Lin Ganpo, the chairman and founder of Yingye, the Chinese outfit. We know that this is only the start of revitalising British Steel, but we believe that this combination will create a powerful, profitable, sustainable business that will ensure the long-term future of thousands of jobs while producing the high-quality steel products that the world needs. Well, I've captioned that, isn't this what the UK government should be doing? David, before I continue with this, gentleman Lee, this is fantastic that the Chinese on the other side of the world can take a look into the British steel industry and say, well, no, that's not going to fail if we put in the right investment, if we have the right future vision and we get stuck in, this can be turned around and made profitable. But our own government doesn't seem to understand that. How can this possibly be?
Well, we haven't actually got a government, have we? What we've got is some disgusting load of nonsense. You know, you couldn't get anything more apparent and blatantly contradictory, where we have this indictment that our own government is incapable of even producing steel. Alarm bells, anyone. You know, if you can't produce steel, you can't produce anything. There's no start. There's no opening. Well, let's put that and that on a machine tool and start making some stuff. If you're not making the raw material, so if they're saying that they're not capable or willing, so Gambit one was we'll let the Turkish Army pension fund buy British Steel. Well, why isn't this being done in Britain? You know, why are they better at it and capable of it than we're at? Hang on, we invented most of this stuff in terms of an industrial revolution. You know, if anybody wants to be doing anything, it wants to be our end, surely. I mean, this couldn't be more apparent, because what they're really telling us, if we want to stand back and be absolutely candid about this, is that they're not interested in making anything in Britain. Because if you're not interested in making anything, you don't need any steel, do you? So therefore, shut the steel plants.
Well,
it's really straightforward. You know, the trigger for this, I think, really was with the successor to the Astute submarines, where they were buying French steel. So all of this, I could lose my temper. All of this stuff coming out of the Labour Party about jobs and their Labour values, where are they now with this?
Absolutely. What we're watching is the shutting down of UK. That's what we're watching. And this is a cross-party policy. It's obvious. Let's follow through on the man who's going to save British Steel. So here he is. Now, we got some good quotes from that Grimsby Live. Taking advantage of China's transition from a totalitarian state to a controlled free market economy, in 1985, Li Ganpo founded the Cannes foodstuff factory of Huzhou River and the Pingshan Brewery. In 1988, he founded Yingye, first with a chemical plant. So we're to believe that this man started out in canned foodstuffs, and he ultimately has produced an economic empire on his own. What's his background? School teacher. He went on to become one of almost 3,000 deputies at the 11th National People's Congress in 2008, sitting as the equivalent of an MP in China's parliament. That's a pretty accurate comparison in some ways, which sat 5 times in 5 years, deciding Chinese legislation and steering the country's economic future. So we're getting a little look into the fact that this is not an ordinary businessman. This man is a powerful part of the Chinese government, and the Chinese government is now being given British Steel at a throwaway price of 50 million by the government of occupation in UK. And he's smiling. Well, he would be smiling because he's reputed to be worth at least 500 million. What is his psychology? It's about getting people rich and repaying society, and in return to reflect his own approach of hard work, humility and loyalty, and that's the bywords for his ideal employee, and it's enshrined in the company name, which apparently means dedication. So this is what we're told about him, that it was his skills in politics and business that ensured the continued growth and success of the Yingye Group. By then, chemicals had led to steel works, which then expanded into trade, logistics and tourism. You can stay in a Yingye hotel and even take an aspirin made by the company. This is not a true story, because this is obviously a very powerful man who's working directly with the Chinese government. But let's remind ourselves of other things that are being said about the Chinese at the moment. This is the BBC. They've got a very interesting article about indoctrination camps where hundreds of thousands of Muslims, they say, are being brainwashed by the Chinese. And I've just taken one quote off their video. It looks like a Nazi playbook to me. Well, if that's true, BBC, surely you should be investigating why the same Nazi playbook is taking over steel. But this is quite an interesting one from the South China Morning Post. They were pointing out that after Boris Johnson was elected, he was absolutely courting China to come and invest in UK. Don't forget, we are the most open international investment destination, particularly for Chinese investment. We have Chinese companies coming in to do Hinkley, for instance, the big nuclear power plant. And we then see a different side here from foreign politics. They're talking about the so-called National Basketball Association's Hong Kong disaster. If you're not aware of what that is, it's to do with them putting out a tweet that the Chinese didn't like. So a little bit of stuff and nonsense, but inside it's saying something very interesting. This is what the Western public and governments must be aware of. Chinese companies do not operate under the same rules as Western companies. A Chinese corporation is not merely an economic entity, it is by necessity a political extension of Beijing's will, both in domestic policy in China and increasingly in global markets. And what it's saying is that there are plenty of times, whether we like it or not, a Chinese corporation is always a potential Trojan horse in waiting at the beck and call of Beijing. Before I pass it back to you, David, China threatens military response if UK warships go near disputed islands. Is this country an enemy or not? On one hand, we're told that the Chinese are extremely dangerous, and then we're simply seeing that our strategic industries like steel are being handed to them on a plate for 50 million.
Yes, I mean, beautifully put. My point of view is this: is that I don't have per se a problem with these people in China or in Turkey wanting to go about and do business and make money. That's what they should be doing. So fair play to them. However, what I do have a problem with is our own gutless politicians, our own gutless cabinet, and gutless prime ministers that are not prepared to do something about what we're doing. They're clearly not bothered about being a functioning country at all, and they're prepared to give away the family silver for 50 shekels for somebody foreign to come in and sweep up. We did all this with the Mittals and everybody in the decades ago, where there was no money in steel. They got rid of it for 5 pence, and then 5 minutes later, there's a massive rush on steel, and all these people that were involved, predominantly Indian, were making billions. And this is the level of short-sighted business approach from these people that are supposed to be in government representing us. So it comes down to them, and they're being allowed to get away with it. That's the problem.
Absolutely.
We've got to add, and we are allowing them to get away with it unless we do something about it and tackle these people wherever we can.
Okay, if you like what the UK column does and you'd like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community. There are options for joining us there. Your support would be much appreciated and much needed. So that's that. And what's next?
Well, really just a swipe at the BBC, which is always desirable. Video top stories today. I couldn't help but notice the election explained was to check on climate change. So that's second from left on the top of your screen there. And if you clicked on that image, up came this, which to my mind is a children's image. Everything about it is attractive to probably 2, 3, 4-year-old children, but this is now for adults in UK. We've given you some of the most dangerous stuff going on, strategic industry being given away. This is the childish dross. I have to use that word again, Mike. The childish dross being put out with the BBC talking about climate change. But maybe the BBC would be chasing the tank in your opening video, because I would have thought that one tank was putting out enough exhaust to change the world's climate. But serious things here. The BBC crowing that a High Court judge has ruled in favour of permanently banning protests outside the Birmingham school, where parents were complaining that their children were essentially being sexualised at too young an age. Now, what did the BBC do? Of course, it ran the story in a completely biased way, that any parent complaining at the content of the sex education was actually homophobic. And as a result, I believe, of a great effort by the BBC, we've now seen the school successfully go to court for the protests to be banned. And of course, if these protests can be banned, peaceful protests can be banned, any protest anywhere in UK can now be banned by the High Court.
Except for Extinction Rebellion?
Well, I'm going to come on to them in a minute, Mike, but just have a look at the sort of thing the BBC put out. Their big focus here on West Midlands Mayor Andy Street. He said that the protests are clearly homophobic, against LGBT teaching at the primary school, and it's got to stop. Well, of course, that's not the case. The parents who were Christian, Muslim, and indeed Jewish were protesting that their children were being overtly sexualized at too young an age, which is something completely different. But if you're not aware of the definition we now have for homophobia, it's fear, hatred, discomfort with or mistrust of people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And that definition is nothing to do with the actual protest by the parents. So the BBC can be very proud, because essentially they have now helped the British state take another major step in silencing free speech. And of course, the other thing this relates to is the fact that the state wants to claim it is the parent of your child or your children.
Absolutely, but if you're running a school and there's a potential for protest, you don't need to worry, because there's some really excellent advice available from the Department for Education. And for the avoidance of doubt, I'm being somewhat sarcastic when I use the word excellent. But let's have a look and see what gov.uk is saying. Primary school disruption over LGBT teaching / relationships education. And they're saying that relationships education will be compulsory for all primary school age pupils from September 2020. In addition, relationships and sex education will be compulsory for all secondary age pupils, and health education will be compulsory for all pupils. They're saying some organisations are opposed to the introduction of these subjects, or to have some of the expected content set out in the statutory guidance for the subjects, and have been campaigning nationally against the subjects and organising locally to encourage parents to influence schools' teaching. The majority of objections relate to the teaching of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender content, particularly in primary schools. And there's all kinds of advice for the schools. And then we come to part 3, which is all about intelligence sharing and support available. And they say it is important that you pass on intel to the Department for Education about disquiet in your local area and signs that this might be building towards disruptive activity. Department for Education can better support local authorities if there's a real-time picture of issues in local areas and patterns of activity. And they say that you should seek further support for Department for Education, making clear you're asking for support, not just passing on intel, and an official will be in touch quickly to discuss options, and that's in the event that there is actually a problem building. And so the language here, Brian, is quite spectacular. And your point earlier was that it was military.
This is military language. There is no question that this is military language. Possibly you're going to pick it up with specialist police teams as well. But I wonder whether we've got a hint of not only the Metropolitan Police in here, but also 77 Brigade. And let's contrast this immense reaction over what's happened at the Birmingham schools with what the Department of Education's counter-extremism team did when we provided them with evidence that Extinction Rebellion was not only carrying out criminal activity, it was also recruiting children of school age and also using schools to train for that criminal activity. Here's the email, or part of the email, that we sent on the 9th of October 2019. And what have we had back from them? Absolute nothing. Silence, total silence. So we provided documents for Extinction Rebellion, where they were calling for people to break the law. We provided documents showing Extinction Rebellion training people in primary schools, the facilities, using those Department of Education facilities. We provided BBC documentation where the BBC was saying it was concerned, and we provided an excellent analysis by a former head of SO15, the counter-terrorism force within the Met, and the result from the Department of Education was silence. So we can call up all these systems to suppress parents who dare challenge what their children are being taught in school, but if you give the Department of Education evidence, factual evidence of criminal activity by Extinction Rebellion, they don't want to know. What does that suggest?
It suggests that Extinction Rebellion represents government policy.
Indeed. David, this is just in your face what's going on here. We've got an organisation using primary schools, recruiting people of school age to protest, to get involved in, as they define it, criminal activity. The Department of Education turns a blind eye. This is the state running the very extremism which it's warning us to alert them about.
Certainly looks that way. I mean, you've made a very good case there, Brian. It smacks of a very high-handed, heavy-handed High Court attack on parents' free speech and parents' opinion of what they want to have happening or not happening to their children. And yet, on the other hand, you have this political chiaroscuro going on, that you can have clearly an organisation that's, I mean, they're advocating breaking the law and acting the fashion they are, like the Extinction Rebellion are. So you can have the right kind of, that can be the right kind that gets way through, but the parents that say no, that's the wrong kind, and they're going to get some nasty treatment. It's like something out of East Germany.
It's something out of East Germany, and if you're operating an East German system, you need propaganda. Let's come back to the BBC, because as I was looking at one of their web pages, I noticed that they were telling me to trust them because they are trustworthy and reliable. It says here the BBC is recognised by audiences in the UK and around the world as a provider of news that you can trust. So there we are, the BBC says it. But what I was interested in is said our commitment to impartiality is at the heart of that relationship of trust. In all our output, we treat every subject with an impartiality that reflects the full range of views. That is a complete lie, because with respect to what has happened at the Birmingham schools, they have simply ignored the views of the parents and the concerns of the parents. So utterly disgraceful stuff. But if I add to that slide, it's now come up on the bottom. As I was looking at that part of their website, up came the latest BBC breaking news, which was that British celebrity chef Gary Rhodes has died aged 59. His family has announced. Now, it's very sad this gentleman has died, but is this really breaking national news when we are covering the material we're covering? I don't think so. They go on, of course, to praise themselves, but it does say that where appropriate, they will offer links to relevant third-party websites that provide additional information. But of course, those websites are only the websites approved by the BBC. So it's BBC propaganda and lies. Fake news, really, Mike.
Well, absolutely. But it's not all bad news because, this organisation, Readly, commissioned a poll from YouGov, a pan-European poll looking at the issue of fake news. And there were a couple of interesting little bits of statistics that came out of this. So what they said was that on average, 59% of people across Europe are concerned about fake news, but that's 64% in the UK. But there were two interesting statistics in here. Almost half of respondents, so 48%, they say, said they've taken to checking the facts themselves. And I thought that was quite a positive statistic there, because if almost 50% of people are checking the facts for themselves, then we're clearly making progress. Because when you put that together with the fact that they also discovered that only 15% of respondents said that they were currently or would be willing to pay for what they describe as verified journalism, I think that is another very positive statistic. So nobody is prepared to pay for the BBC, The Guardian, and unfortunately we're forced to pay for the BBC through the BBC tax, but the other mainstream news outlets, only 15% of people said that they were prepared to pay for that, because I think that's a fair representation of the value that it provides. Yeah. But 50% of people are checking the facts for themselves. That if that number increases, that can only be a positive thing.
It is good news, absolutely good news, and we need that good news. We'll end on this one. We're going to have to do more work on it. Thank you very much to the person who alerted it. It's from Devon Live, but we can tell you this is also happening across the country. We now have local councils saying that people must be preparing for disaster in UK. And this particular one here from Devon County Council effectively is that what you need is a disaster grab bag with all your essential survival things in it. And here are the two lovely ladies who are discussing what you need to have in your disaster grab bag. Very interesting. The lady on the right has got quite a strong foreign accent, so I'm not sure where she's come from. I'd love to know who she is and how she's got involved with this. But this is happening across the country. And when you look at the way the organisations are all linked together, Mike, I smell the fusion doctrine. But in the first instance, we're ramping up fear factor. What is this disaster that we're expected to prepare for?
But prepping is now a mainstream thing. It's not a fringe activity anymore.
Oh, absolutely not. Lots of details in here. And my initial research this morning shows that the 30 Days, 30 Ways UK, this is a social media run government programme, but this links back to FEMA in America. So we'll do a bit more work on that. Well, we'll end it there, I think. David, thank you very much for joining us. We'll just say, if you're a new viewer to UK Column and you don't quite understand the focus on defence, it's because we are showing that whilst the British government and indeed the mainstream parties in UK are talking Brexit, behind the scenes, the integration into the EU project continues. And of course, Britain's military has already been signed into EU Defence Union, along with procurement, defence industries, and indeed intelligence services. So there can be no Brexit whilst we're not in full control of our own military. We'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.